Now let's talk about the other type of load balancer called Application Gateway. Application Gateway is relatively new, but it's somewhat different than the load balancer that we just went through. If we look at the Application Gateway documentation, you'll see here that it only does web-based load balancing, so HTTP and HTTPS. So you cannot load balance an RDP connection or a database, right? So a SQL server cannot have this application gateway in front of it. Okay, so it's a web thing. It has a firewall option, so it protects you from common attacks, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and session hijacks. So this is different than the load balancer, of course. There's types of affinity. This one's a cookie-based affinity. So the application gateway will manage giving a cookie to the user if you define it that way. And then that same user will keep coming back to the same server based on having the cookie. It does a really cool thing with secure sockets layer where you actually install your secure sockets layer certificate on the application gateway and not on the web server. And so the decryption and encryption of the traffic happens on the gateway, which is like another device. Okay, so it basically gives the performance of your web server maximum dedication to serving up the web content and not having to encrypt and decrypt SSL content. You can have different traffic going to different servers based on the URL. This allows you to have multiple websites all running behind the same load balancer effectively. Okay, so you've got this application gateway, and depending on whether you have one website goes to this VM, a different website goes to a different VM, or if you have subdirectories that need to go to a contest or a blog that needs to go to a separate server, the application gateway handles that. Up to 20 websites in a single gateway and all this stuff. Here's a really useful graphic. So you have the internet. We haven't talked about Azure Traffic Manager yet, and I'm sure when we get into scaling, we'll talk about more about that. But here we have a typical load balancer that we just went through. And see here that they have multiple application gateways running in an availability set, I guess. And then underneath the application gateways, they have virtual machines. And the same virtual machine is associated with more than one application gateway. So it's a really interesting configuration. And if you think about this, application gateway can do the firewall services, it can do the SSL support, and it's just sort of a different type of traffic that it's handling. You can sort of see that there's a function in between the load balancer, which is really a dumb machine. It runs at the network layer, what they call level 4, and it's just routing packets based on source IP, destination IP, and port. And that's the only consideration for routing packets. This is an application level routing, and that's where you can check the URL. And it's running it. It's an HTTP, so it must have a URL. Stuff like that. Firewall, injection attacks, and cross-site scripting. It's doing packet inspection to determine whether the traffic should at least even get through. So this costs money, and you can set it up in some really interesting configurations. There's a comparison here on this page as well. You can see the difference is just similar to what I explained. I'm not going to set up an application gateway right now, but you need to understand this is a more serious type of load balancer, and it may just have a different purpose if you look at graphs like this. All right, thanks.